What are you doing if you aren't making car setups? It's literally free lap time on a silver platter waiting to be claimed by you, but only 26% of you guys are making your own setups. Not knowing how to make your own setup is gonna cost you in the long run, and there's no shortcut to skip it. In this video, I'm gonna cover the basics you need to know for making your own setup and how to fine tune it the proper way. Keep in mind that this is a step-by-step process for tuning the car, and that you should do these steps with me in order as I'm doing them. Let's start off with wing setting. This increases or decreases downforce on the rear wing. When we decrease downforce, we have a decreased turning capability, so the car can't turn as well, but our top speed is higher. When we increase downforce, we have a better turning ability, but our top speed is lower. So here's how we can test wing setting. So start off with the baseline setup and then take a look at the track outline. This is really good for finding a starting point. If the track has really long straights, use low downforce. If there's short twisty turns, use high downforce. And if it's a mix of both, or if you're unsure, use medium downforce. And then test it for a few laps. And then answer these questions. Is the car turning enough? And is it worth it to lower wing to gain in some corners? And then adjust based on that. Now that we have a good wing setup, we can move on to toe. So toe is where the front and rear tires are pointing. They can be parallel with the car, meaning that they're straight. They can face inwards or they can face outwards. Negative toe means that the tires are pointing outwards. Positive toe means that the tires are pointing inwards, and neutral toe means that the tires are just going straight. Keep in mind that front and rear toe are two separate things, so we can have positive front toe, negative rear toe, and the other way around. And also, they affect the car in different ways. Increasing front toe might lead to X, but increasing rear toe will probably lead to Y. So don't expect the same thing to happen if you do one thing to the other. Let's start off with front toe. So increasing front toe leads to increased straight line stability, more understeer, and more tire wear on the fronts. Decreasing front toe leads to less straight line stability, oversteer, and less tire wear on the fronts. In racing, we almost always see negative toe on the fronts. Now onto the rears. Increasing rear toe leads to better rear stability, especially during the mid-corner and the exit. It also leads to less tire wear. Decreasing toe leads to less rear stability, especially during the mid-corner and the exit. It also leads to oversteer, and it also makes the car harder to control at high speeds. In racing, we almost always use positive toe on the rear tires. Now, here's how we test the toe. So use the previous setup with the adjusted wing and everything else baseline, and do small isolated changes. So don't change the front and the rear toe at the same time. Start with the front toe and test it for a few laps. Is it understeering or oversteering? Is it stable in a straight line? Are the tires losing grip? And you can answer these questions with this table over here. Okay, once we get a good front toe, we can start testing the rear toe. Is it stable mid-corner and at corner exit? Is it oversteering or understeering? And can you control it at high speeds? And you have this table over here for reference. Now we have a good wing and toe, so let's move on to camber. Camber is the angle of the tires when you view them from front or behind. So neutral camber would be when the tires are just flat on the ground. Positive camber would be when the top of the tires are pointing outwards, and negative camber would be when the top of the tires are pointing inwards. Front and rear camber are not tied to each other, so if you have a negative camber on the fronts, you don't have to have it negative on the rears. You can have positive on the rears if you want, or neutral. It's really flexible. Increasing front camber leads to less cornering grip, understeer, and more straight line stability. Decreasing front camber leads to more cornering grip at high speeds, less understeer, and way less straight line stability. In racing, we almost always have negative camber on the front tires. Decreasing rear camber leads to more cornering grip, worse traction, and better cornering stability. So here is how we test camber. Use the previous setup with the adjusted wing and toe and everything else as baseline, and make small isolated changes, so don't change the front and rear camber at the same time. Start off with the front tires and test it for a few laps, and then answer these questions. Is there enough cornering grip? Is it understeering or oversteering? And is it stable in a straight line? And you have the table for reference. After the fronts are good, move on to the rear tires and test them for a few laps. Then answer these questions. Is there enough traction? Is it oversteering? Is it stable throughout the corner? And table here for reference. Now that we have a good wing, toe, and camber, we can move on to ride height. Ride height is how high up the car is off the ground. So a low ride height would mean that the car is really close to the ground, and a high ride height would mean that the car is really far off from the ground, and a medium ride height would be somewhere in between. Let's start off with the front tires. A high ride height would lead to understeer, less front downforce, and more drag. A low front ride height would lead to better cornering stability, more front downforce, but it would not be good on bumps. So if you're on a really bumpy track like Sebring or the Nordschleife, it would not be good. It would pretty much bottom out every time if there's a bump. Now let's move on to rear ride height. Increasing rear ride height leads to more rear downforce, and if you do it excessively and only excessively, then it will lead to understeer. But if you only do it a bit, there's no understeer. It also leads to better rear stability. Decreasing the rear ride height leads to less rear downforce, a higher top speed, but again, the car is not good on bumps. Same like the front ride height, it'll bottom out on bumps. Okay, here's how we test the rear ride height. So use the previous setup with the adjusted wing, toe, camber, and everything else as baseline, and make small isolated changes, so don't change the front and rear ride height at the same time. Start off with the front ride height and test it for a few laps. Then answer these questions. Is it understeery? How is the car in high-speed corners? And is the top speed too low? And table here for reference. Now get a good front ride height and use that to test the rear ride height now. And answer these questions. Is there enough traction? Is the car stable at high speeds? And is it good on bumps? And table here for reference. Now we have everything else except the anti-roll bar. The anti-roll bar connects the left and the right side wheels on the same axle to each other. The job of the ARB is to reduce the weight shifted to the outside tires while cornering. So if we stiffen it, there's more load to the outside tires. But if we loosen it, there's less load to the outside tires. Also keep in mind we can have a stiff front and a loose rear, or the other way around. They don't have to be the same as each other. Let's start off with the front ARB. So if we stiffen it, it leads to understeer and better stability under braking. If we loosen the front ARB, it leads to oversteer and less response on initial turn-in. Now onto the rear ARB. If we stiffen it, the car feels oversteery and twitchy. But if we loosen it, the car will feel understeery and lazy. And here's how we test the ARB. So use the previous setup with the adjusted wing, toe, camber, ride height, and everything else as baseline. Small isolated changes, so don't change the front and the rear ARB at the same time. And then start with the fronts and test it for a few laps. And then answer these questions. Is it understeery? Is it stable under braking? And how is the initial turn-in? And you have the table here for reference to answer these questions. And then get a good front ARB and move on to the rear one. And for the rear ARB, you gotta answer these questions. Is it understeering or oversteering? Is the car twitchy? Is the car lazy? And you have this table for reference. And that's how you properly set up a car. Subscribe if you want, and bye.